The desert wind slapped across Jonas Thorne's face, carrying the scent of scorched sagebrush and a memory he had buried beneath stone 2 decades ago. Before him, an Apache girl hung by the wrists from a black cypress tree, her blood dripping onto the ground beneath a crudely written sign scrawled in blood, "White man don't forgive." Jonas had once left his own brother behind to save a native child. Now he stood before another dying soul, and a past that had never forgiven him. The western desert of New Mexico was rarely truly silent. As the sun began to sink, its final light painted the stone outcrops red, like blood seeping across dry skin. Beneath that sky, you could almost hear the land cracking, not literally, but like the sound of a loneliness that had lived too long. Jonas Thorne rode a weathered gray-brown horse. Its name was Deacon, a gentle, steady creature, walking slow as if deep in thought across the empty land. He wore an old cloak, his shoulders slightly stooped with age. At 55, Jonas no longer expected much from anyone, but now and then he still called out softly for his little dog. "Chess, where are you?" The hot wind swept through the yucca and 3-on grass, carrying the parched scent of dirt and sun. Chess had gone missing since the afternoon, chasing a rabbit out past the rocky gulch behind the timber station. Jonas had followed the faint tracks, leading down into a shallow ravine where the day's darkness gathered first. He hadn't meant to go far. It was just a dog. But some evenings, it's the small things that make a man return to what he tried to forget. And then he saw it. A lone black cypress tree, dry and skeletal in the heart of the ravine. Its bark was gnarled and hollow, like an old man who had long lost his dreams. From its largest branch, a small body was strung up by braided thorn rope, arms spread wide as if crucified, though no nails were used. It wasn't a hanging by the neck. It was by the wrists, a punishment not meant to kill outright, but to drain a soul slowly and silently. He guessed it was a girl, slight in build with long black hair, her head slumped against her chest, wrists bleeding, feet barely touching the ground. Not enough to stand, not enough to die quickly. Her body was thin, skin sun-darkened, bones showing through a film of dust. A figure that had once been human, now strung like a warning sign. Jonas didn't move closer. His eyes paused on a wooden board nailed into the tree trunk above her head. The letters were painted in something dark and clotted, unclear if it was paint or blood. "White man don't forgive," no period, no explanation. Just a shard of curse jammed into the air, a warning for anyone reckless enough to interfere. The wind made the rope hiss faintly against the girl's skin, a small sound, but enough to send a chill down Jonas's back. He dismounted slowly, step by step. No gun drawn, no name called. Deacon stood still, head lowered. Chess no longer barked. The whole desert seemed frozen in that moment, where sunset's red and the earth's darkness bled into each other without boundary. Jonas removed his hat. He simply stood there, head bowed slightly like an old soldier before an untended grave. He didn't know who the girl was. Apache, perhaps. A criminal, perhaps. A trap, even. But whatever she was, one thing was certain. This was a human body near death, but not yet dead. In the belly of the dry desert, as the sun prepared to die and no fire yet rose, some decisions were not measured by reason. They came from instinct, the kind modern men had forgotten. To hold on to something that was still warm. Jonas stayed still, hand resting on his hat brim. He didn't breathe hard. He said nothing. He didn't repeat any of the old prayers. He just waited, as if listening for a sign from the earth or the sky or the wound inside him to know that, this time, he would not walk away. The wind shifted as Jonas stepped closer to the black cypress. Not much. Just enough to puff his coat slightly at the shoulders and to make the wooden sign creak like the teeth of a dying man. He stopped before the girl. Her hands were bound with mesquite thorn rope, wrapped 3 times and sunk deep into flesh. The dried blood had settled into each crease like a compact curse, fastened tight around the wrists of someone no one had named. Her body barely moved. Only her chest trembled faintly when the wind passed through, like an oil lamp drained to the dregs, yet still trying to burn a little longer. Jonas reached out and touched the rope, coarse, aged, and ragged, like it had been dragged from the shed of someone used to hurting things. He could have cut it with a single stroke, but he stood still a moment longer, eyes fixed on the girl's face. Her cheek was swollen, her forehead scraped raw, her lips cracked and dry as pumice, yet her eyelashes remained long, dust-covered, and lifted slightly, as if still holding on to something that hadn't yet fallen. No groan, no cry for help. The pain here had passed long ago. What remained was the body and existence. Jonas drew the buckknife from the leather sheath at his hip. The blade glinted in the dusk, not bright but sharp enough to do what hands could not. He gripped the rope with his left hand. With his right, he slowly slid the knife between the thorns and the skin. The rope made a brittle crack, like a final breath. Then it snapped. The girl fell. She didn't scream. Jonas knelt to catch her. Her body was light, not from weight, but from the way everything inside had already left her. Bone and flesh in his arms felt like a bundle of dry wood wrapped in cloth. She collapsed into him like someone who had just stopped fighting death. A stream of hot air touched his neck, her breath thin as spider silk. Enough to know she was still alive. Enough to know that if nothing was done, she soon wouldn't be. Jonas shrugged off his old leather coat. Part of the back had split from a fire last year near the station. He wrapped it around her, trying to cover every inch of bare skin. Each movement was like someone gathering broken pieces, not to save, but because he couldn't bear not to. Deacon stood a few steps away. The horse watched them without blinking, as if it understood. Jonas lifted her, laid her sideways across the saddle. Then he climbed up behind her, holding the girl between his arms, not embracing, holding, like holding a secret, half dead and unwanted, that no one wished to know. He didn't look back at the cypress, didn't look at the sign, didn't look at the thorn rope lying on the ground. He only gave the reins a gentle tug. Deacon shuddered once, then began to move. On the way home, the sky darkened. The wind fell still. There was only the sound of saddle leather brushing against ribs, the labored breathing of the old horse, and the soft, clicking murmur of the reins, like the faint heartbeat of the desert. Jonas's timber station wasn't large, nor was it small. Just enough for one man to live alone without being swallowed whole by silence. It stood quietly on the side of a low hill, its face turned westward, as if waiting for the sun to return from wherever it disappeared. Each night. The door was never locked. Jonas gave it a gentle push. The hinge groaned, and the scent of old ash, pine wood, and faded tobacco drifted out to greet its owner. He stepped inside, careful not to bump the broken chair he hadn't fixed in years. The girl, in his arms, was still unconscious, but now, under the pale yellow light of the oil lamp swaying from the ceiling, her face became clearer, the face of someone who had survived, but wasn't sure she wanted to keep surviving. Jonas laid her down on the simple, patchworked wooden bed. He adjusted the pillow, pulled a thin wool blanket over her from shoulders to feet. His eyes moved quickly over the marks on her body, a deep bruise on her left hip, scrapes along her ribcage, and both wrists red and swollen, still embedded with mesquite thorns. He said nothing. He only pulled a small knife from the pocket of his chest coat and gently removed each thorn from the wound, as if extracting needles from someone's heart. Then he lit the stove. Water boiled in a dented iron pot. Jonas opened a small cupboard on the wall and took out a bundle of dried sagebrush leaves tied with twine, left behind by his mother. the only remedy she ever trusted for pain that had no name. He tossed the leaves into the pot. The water turned murky, its bitter scent filling the room. Then he reached for an old handkerchief, the floral edges worn to near threadbare, once belonging to his grandmother, dipped it in the brew, wrung it gently, and knelt beside the bed, not with the posture of a doctor, but of someone trying to atone for something. He took the girl's hand, touched the edge of the cloth to her wrist, where yellowed fluid still seeped from the wound. She didn't wake, but her brow furrowed, the first reaction since he had seen her beneath the tree. Jonas paused. His eyes met hers. Only for a second. She didn't fully open them, just a sliver. The gaze was blurred, caught between darkness, oil light, and exhaustion. But in it was something that made Jonas falter, not fear, but emptiness, like a room that had once held a whole family and now only held dust. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why she was there. He simply turned to the wooden cupboard by the wall, opened it, and took out the one thing he hadn't used since his mother passed. A small wooden cup, its rim worn smooth with a crooked cross carved into the side. Jonas placed it on the table, about an arm's length from the bed. He didn't pour water into it, left no note. He just set it there, so when she woke, if she woke, she would know. This was the cup for someone meant to stay. Not a prisoner, not a ghost, but someone expected, someone waited for. Then he rose and turned the oil lamp down to its lowest flame. Chess lay at the foot of the bed, head resting on her front paws, eyes half closed. Jonas sat in the chair beside the window, pulled a pipe from his pocket, but didn't light it. He only held it between his teeth, eyes fixed on the flickering lamp shadow dancing across the ceiling, as if it were trying to preserve the last bit of warmth from a day that didn't want to end. Outside, the night had fallen, but in here the light hadn't yet gone out. The night sky over the southern hills of New Mexico held no sound of howling wolves, only wind, steady and deep, like the breath of something older than man, older than soil, than stone, than sin. Jonas Thorne sat on the wooden step of his porch, hands resting on his knees, an old pipe held loosely between his fingers, never lit. The wind passed through his coat, carrying the scent of cold ash, rusted iron, and a faint trace of boiled sage, the scent of something he never thought he'd use again. The moon hung low on the horizon, flat as an old silver coin, too faint to illuminate anything but memory, his eyes fixed on the Pedernal Range in the distance, where the skyline dipped like the edge of a lazy knife. Not far from there, a rocky gulch, the place where he'd once laid his brother's body after that skirmish with the Apache years ago. You chose to save the enemy. Who came to save me? That voice, Elam's, his younger brother's, still echoed every time Jonas was silent too long, as if his soul had lodged somewhere between Jonas's ribs and that rotting patch of ceiling above him. He had once served in the cavalry, not a hero, not a coward, just did what he was told and lived through it. During a raid on an Apache village, when fire consumed the tents and gunfire bounced off the valley walls, Jonas saw a mother clutching her dying child, her eyes just like his mother's back when she died of fever. Not far from them, Elam had fallen, blood pooling beneath him. Jonas had turned his horse around. He saved the child, thinking he'd have time to return, but Elam bled out too fast. You chose the enemy. Who came to save me? His brother's voice didn't come from his mouth anymore. It came from the hollow inside Jonas, a voice that had risen every night since. Jonas leaned forward, glanced at the basin of water by the window. The water had changed color, tinged with faint red, sticky from sage resin, a few strands of black hair clinging to the rim. No words were needed. That was enough for Jonas to know that tonight's blood wasn't new. It was old pain resurfaced, a cycle he could never escape. The Apache girl inside, no name, no words, now lay there like a question without a period, just like the child he once saved, just like Elam, who never forgave. Jonas took a breath. The dry air burned his nostrils. He tapped the pipe lightly on the wood step. There was no tobacco, but he smoked anyway, because sometimes a man doesn't need smoke. He just needs something to keep his hands busy. When the memories flood in like a storm tide, Chess padded out quietly, curled beside his boots. She lifted her head to look at Jonas, then stared into the dark beyond the porch. Neither of the two old creatures said a word, because some nights weren't made for speaking. They were meant for silence, for listening to the sound of blood draining from the heart. The next morning there was no sun, only a flat gray sky, like stagnant water in a dry well, rippling faintly beneath the shift of seasonal wind. Jonas was repairing the eastern fence when he saw dust spiraling up from the dirt road that led to the station. A horse was approaching, rising and falling like some ill-shaped omen. He didn't have to guess. Not a merchant, not someone lost. It was news, and news in places where the land is dry and hearts even drier rarely means anything good. The man stopped his horse, patting its mane to calm it. He wore a black hat and on his chest a pinned badge with the insignia of the territorial court. A courier and examiner and the kind of witness for the law that no one particularly loved. He dismounted, holding out a sheet of paper, still fresh, its corners already touched by dust. No ceremony. His voice was hoarse but not hostile. Word came in: an Apache girl escaped from Fort Garrison, suspected of aiding in the murder of a horse trader. $100 bounty. If seen, report immediately. Jonas accepted the paper but didn't read it right away. He just looked at the man's eyes, at his hands, then glanced up at the sky, as if to see whether someone else might be watching. After a long pause, he smiled, though it wasn't quite a smile, just a slight twitch of the mouth, enough to scatter the dead weight in the air. "I haven't seen anyone," he said, "except the goat and a few ghosts." The man nodded, neither believing nor denying. His eyes drifted toward the cabin. The window was shut, stove smoke still rising slow and steady. Then he turned his horse. "If anything strange happens, you know what to do." Jonas didn't answer. He just held the paper, standing there until the man's shape shrank into the dust and disappeared. Back inside, he went straight to the kitchen, laid the wanted poster on the table, and pinned it down with a dull paring knife. Didn't read it carefully. He didn't need to. He had already read it in the courier's eyes. The only thing he did after that was open the cupboard beside the stove. He pulled out the old wooden sign, the one he had removed from her wrist. "White man don't forgive." The letters were carved deep. The ink had soaked into the grain. Someone had likely used a heated blade to burn them in, not just as a warning, but as a sentence passed by those who'd never been allowed a defense. Jonas stared at the sign for a long time. Then he threw it into the fireplace. The flames didn't roar, just crackled softly like tears hitting cold coals. The wood burned slowly, very slowly, as if it didn't want to be consumed, only linger a little longer to see if he'd change his mind. Jonas didn't change his mind. He just stood there, watching as the words cracked into ash. The last piece to fall, "forgive," flared into one small flicker, then went dark. No one witnessed the act, only him, and his own reflection in the glass pane of the cupboard, a man who didn't lie, but also didn't speak truth. Just stood silent in the space between two things no one could tell apart anymore. The wind brushed softly beneath the wooden eaves, carrying the creak of rope tied to the water trough, the rasping cry of an old rooster somewhere far off, and the faint smell of damp soil, a scent that only came after ash had cooled. A few days had passed since the girl arrived. She hadn't asked, hadn't groaned, hadn't run. She just lay there, like a body the world had discarded, unclaimed, unwanted. Jonas didn't press her. He knew some souls took longer than bodies to wake. That day, the sky was strangely clear. Jonas was sharpening the scythe behind the house when Chess, the old dog, usually expressionless, let out a quiet whine. He turned. The girl stood at the doorway, barefoot, still wearing the dress he had found in an old trunk, too large for someone so small. Her tangled hair hung loose, hiding the bruise on her left temple. She stepped down the wooden stairs. Her eyes did not meet Jonas's, not fearful nor trusting, just the look of someone testing whether the ground beneath her feet was still earth or just a dream crushed too long beneath weight. She walked slowly, past the clothesline, past the barrel he used to catch dew. She neared the spot where Jonas had burned the sign. Ash still mottled the dirt like dried bloodstains. She knelt in silence, left hand holding a dry twig. Where she'd gotten it, he didn't know. Her right hand moved slowly, carving something into the ashen soil, each line measured exact as if done by old habit or perhaps ritual. From where Jonas stood, the shape became clear. A fox, curled low to the ground, its tail wrapped around its body. But the eyes were open. Not a wounded creature, but one watching, guarding, ready to bite if touched. She set the twig beside the drawing, said nothing. Jonas stood a few steps away. He didn't come closer, didn't retreat. He simply removed his hat and bowed his head, the only gesture he knew for something he didn't understand, but respected. Then he placed the hat beside the fox, as though it were part of the ritual, even if he didn't know its name. The wind passed through, branches above creaked. The girl remained seated, eyes fixed on the drawing, unblinking. Chess came near, sniffed the ground. No barking, just lay down beside her, resting her head on the girl's legs, as if they had known each other a long time. Jonas struck a match and lit his pipe. For the first time in many nights, smoke curled from the old wooden stem, slow, unhurried, like a sigh from someone far too familiar with silence. That day no one said anything, but something left the realm of the dead, in the shape of a fox and the barefoot steps of a girl who walked out of a house thought to be closed forever. The morning after, the sky stretched high and blue, like the open mouth of a beast already full of blood. The air carried a metallic taste, a taste only those who've lost someone can recognize, even if they cannot explain it. Jonas was bundling hay when he noticed the cabin door creak open. The Apache girl, the one he still had no name to call, stepped outside. She held the faded wool blanket in her arms. The wind curled around her hem like waves licking at stone, but not enough to move her. She didn't walk toward the fox drawing as she had before. Instead, she sat on the wooden steps, in the very spot where Jonas often sat with his pipe. A pause followed, longer than usual, but not heavy. It felt like someone gathering enough of the world's air to open a wound. Then her voice came, soft, not a whisper, but the sound of someone who had survived, speaking aloud to herself. My father's name was Anakai. He was a healer, not a shaman, not a sorcerer, just a man who knew herbs, river water, and how to read the sky for days. Jonas didn't turn. He kept tying the hay bundle with rawhide, his motions slow, as if he were binding a story into memory. They came, not soldiers, not exactly townsfolk either, a group of men with a flag, white and red. They called my father a witch, shot my mother when she ran toward him, hung my father like a message for those no longer willing to be afraid. I was the youngest. They didn't kill me, they beat me, then hung me from a tree, with that sign, so anyone passing by would read it. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble, but her right hand clenched, fingernails digging into her skin. the rope mark still pressed into her wrist, a tattoo without ink. Only then did Jonas stop. He set the hay bundle down. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "I understand," because he knew. Those words were as cheap as stagnant water at the bottom of a trough, meant for people who had never seen someone die because of another man's gaze. Instead, he bent down, used his fingers to trace into the dirt just outside the porch. He redrew the fox. Then he placed his fingertip right on its eye, the place where she had drawn it open. Not an act of redemption, not sympathy, just the only way he knew how to answer a survivor without turning them into a victim. The wind passed between them, not like yesterday. Today's wind was softer, carrying the scent of mugwort and the faint feeling of changing seasons. The girl said nothing more, but she stayed there a long time, and Jonas, for the first time since Elam's death, did not hear his brother's voice in his head. Only the wind, the creak of old rope on the water trough, and the earth breathing beneath the fox's open eyes. The first rains came to the high plain in mid-month, not heavy, not loud, just a gentle patter, like the footsteps of someone who had once left, now returning to knock softly on the old tin roof. Jonas sat in the kitchen, holding a steaming cup of tea. Outside the window, the girl, still unnamed, still unsmiling, was quietly tending the fire in the porch stove. Her movements were slow, but no longer trembling like they were in the early days. Something had changed, though its shape was not yet clear. That night the fire in the hearth burned low, not bright enough to erase the dark, but warm enough to heat two bodies sitting across from each other. Jonas pulled an old wooden pipe from the drawer. He didn't smoke, just rolled it gently in his hands, as if trying to feel the rhythm of time inside the grain. It was a long while before he spoke. He didn't look at her, no preamble. His voice just rose from a place long buried under dust. My brother's name was Elam. 18, hot-tempered, stubborn. He used to sit with me by the fire under moonless skies, talking about the day we'd buy land, build a house. His eyes were bright, like this land would never burn his dreams. Jonas paused, his gaze falling into the fire, as if searching for himself in the red coals. During a raid, smoke swallowed the tents. Gunfire echoed like stone breaking. I saw an Apache woman holding her child, and her eyes looked like my mother's the day she died of fever. Elam had fallen nearby, blood soaking into the dirt. I turned my horse, saved the child, thought a few minutes would be enough to come back, but Elam had already stopped breathing. You chose the enemy, his voice echoed in my head, sharp as a blade. Jonas drew a breath, nostrils burning from smoke and memory. I'm not a bad man, but I was a coward. I left the army, bought this station, been waiting, but never sure for who. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe it was just a habit, like setting a cup upside down to keep out dust, even if no one ever intended to pour water. The girl stayed silent the whole time he spoke. No questions, no interruption. Only after a long pause, when he had truly stopped, did she stand, walk to the corner where he kept the bundle of dried sagebrush, and pull out a single stem, thin as a pinky finger. She returned and laid it on the table beside his hand. No words. Jonas looked at the stalk. The leaves had curled, but the scent remained. That soothing scent. Not one that hides pain, but one that helps you live alongside it. Longer. He nodded, didn't smile, just nodded, like a man who had once done something unforgivable, and had just been gently reminded there was still some part of him left that was worth saving. That night, Jonas did not dream of Elam. He didn't see his brother's body hanging upside down in the shed. He saw only a fox, lying beside the fire, eyes open, and a small girl stroking its spine as the wind carried the scent of burning sage mingled with flame. The first winter morning descended over the low hills in a pale yellow hue, like light passing softly through the eyes of the old. Jonas was tying down the chicken coop roof after last night's storm. The tin sheets had peeled back from the rafters, exposing rotting beams he had promised to replace for 3 seasons straight. From the doorway, the girl stepped out. Nothing outwardly different. Still the same loose dress, still hair untouched by a proper comb. But something had left her eyes. Maybe it was the darkness, maybe fear, maybe just a piece of the past too tired to keep holding on. That day, for the first time, she cooked. Nothing fancy, just cornmeal porridge with a bit of salted meat, in the cast-iron pot Jonas usually used to feed the horse. She placed 2 wooden bowls on the table. No invitation, no glance. Jonas stepped inside, removed his gloves, and smelled the faint char of toasted corn. He said nothing. Sat down, quietly. The wooden spoon tapped the bowl, a sound as soft as footsteps across snow. That evening, the cold deepened. The fire still burned, but there are chills that wood alone can't chase off. Jonas opened the wooden chest and took out an old cup, a maple wood cup, the last thing left of his mother, the woman who died of fever one September when he was only 13. He placed the cup on the table, between 2 cleaned bowls, said nothing. She looked at the cup, then looked at him, not with the eyes of someone asking, but with the eyes of someone who'd always stood outside a house, now told that this seat, no one would take it from her. That night, as he put away the tools by the hearth, Jonas exhaled a breath so soft, no one heard it, no one understood it. It was simply a word, long lodged in his throat, finally stepping out. Nia. She was splitting firewood behind the house. Her hands paused, but she didn't turn. The next day he called again. Nia, give the horse the bean hay under that roof. Nia, rain's coming, pull the firewood in. Never loud, never urgent, just enough. Like a man calling the name of a beloved animal, not expecting a reply, only needing them to know, I see you, you exist. A name didn't have to be asked for, didn't have to be bestowed, only used, like a part of the morning breath, of footsteps, of mealtime. Nia never repeated the name, but she began folding the blanket each morning, began washing the bowls, began walking the horse pen in the late afternoons, holding a sprig of sage, just like he always did. One night, in the firelight, Jonas looked at the wooden cup. It lay between them like a story still half untold. He didn't touch it, and she didn't move away. That night, Chess the dog lay at her feet, not at his as she always had before. Maybe affection doesn't begin with a smile or tender words. Maybe it starts with a name. A cup, a shared meal in a house where wind still passes through, but where now, at last, you can hear the clink of bowls touching. The nearest town lay a day's ride from Jonas Thorne's cabin, if the rains hadn't come and the floods hadn't carried off the bridge. A sorrowful place with more saloons than schools, and mouths always wider than hearts. Nia only went out when it was truly necessary, usually to gather wild greens or let the chickens run near the tree line. That day the sun was oddly bright, the rare kind of warmth in a cold month that lures people from the shadows, as if light itself were bait for a trap. She stood beneath the gnarled maple near the trail, where one could look down the rough road leading toward town. Her old dress flapped lightly in the wind. Hair fell over one side of her face, hiding the bruised cheek. From a distance, one might mistake her for a lost settler girl, if they didn't look closely at the earth-red skin and the eyes that did not drop like the others of her kind. 3 days later, the soldiers came, not with gunfire or pounding hooves, but with the stiff tap of leather boots on Jonas's porch as he mended a saddle. They made no effort to hide. Someone had seen her. And they didn't come to conceal it. They came to collect a debt. The one leading them was a young lieutenant. Dark red wool coat, neatly parted hair, eyes pale as a sky before a storm. He walked as if every pebble beneath his boot was a sin that needed grinding. There was a rumor. His brother had died in a skirmish near Prescott Hill, blamed on a group of young Apache. Since then, the lieutenant carried a shapeless rage, aimed at no one in particular, but always ready to be poured out on anyone with red-blooded skin. No one asked if it was true, but in the way he held up the paper, gray ink, fresh creases, you could tell this wasn't just duty. Apache girl, suspect, $100 reward. No image, just a line of description. Young, thin, dark skin. Scar on right wrist. Each word sliced through the quiet of the cabin like a knife. Jonas didn't blink. He spat out the stub of his roll, ground it underfoot, then looked up, slow, as if the answer had been waiting in his chest for years. Only wind and dust out here. Haven't seen a living soul. No challenge, no pleading, just a man speaking truth in a way that made truth and mockery indistinguishable. The lieutenant curled his lip. No argument, no threat. He left the paper on the wooden table and rode off. As the hooves faded, Jonas stepped inside. The door was still closed, curtains still drawn, but he could feel it. The breath inside the house had changed. He didn't ask how much she'd heard, didn't ask if she was afraid. He just walked straight out to the shed. There, in a corner dust-covered for 5 years, he found an old piece of maple. Not the sign that had read, "White man don't forgive." That was ash now, but a fragment of his mother's walking stick, the one she used when gathering sage. He brought it inside. Didn't look at Naya, just placed it on the table beside the wooden cup carved with a cross. Then he took out his small knife and began to carve. Just one shape, a fox, just like the one she had drawn in ash, its eyes open, staring straight ahead. Each stroke of the blade was a breath, slow, careful, as if he were not just carving the fox, but everything it stood for. Survival, vigilance, and a promise left unspoken. Nia stood behind the curtain, watching silently. When Jonas set the carved wood beside the cup, she stepped forward and touched the fox gently, said nothing, just nodded. A soft nod, like the earth nodding back to rain. She didn't ask if he'd done it for her or for himself. But that night, she cleaned out the fabric chest. For the first time, she washed the dress she'd worn since the day she was saved. The next morning, she wore one of Jonas's shirts, huge on her, sleeves falling to her knees. She passed through the door. No permission, no bowed head, as if even though the world outside had yet to forgive, within this house, she had been allowed to live. The night wind rushed through the rock crevices like the dying howl of an old beast. No one said trouble was coming, but the crows gathering on the dead tree near the cabin said it for them. Jonas counted at least 12 hoofbeats in the dark, though he could only hear 6. He didn't light a lamp, just sat in the dimness by the window, the old rifle laid across his lap, its barrel covered by the weak old shirt sleeve, like a silent farewell. Naya was out back. Beneath the roof of the abandoned docks shed, she packed a small bag, bundles of sage leaves, a handkerchief, the wooden knife, and Jonas's mother's wooden cup. The hoofbeats stopped, less than 300 steps from the house. No voice, no knock, only a warning shot, piercing the tin roof, making Chess howl once, then fall silent. Jonas looked out back where Nia was quietly tightening the saddle strap. Their eyes met, not like father and daughter, not like lovers, just two souls once broken, now held together by shared loss. "This time, you run," his voice low as the earth. "Don't wait for a miracle." She didn't answer, just helped him up as he limped toward the shed. The second shot rang out. The back wall exploded. A wooden shard struck Jonas's thigh, blood seeping through the cloth. He collapsed. "Run, Nia!" But she didn't run. She heaved him onto the horse, looped the reins over her wrist, and picked up the rifle he'd left behind. Hands that had never held a weapon, but a face born for this moment long before this lifetime. The soldiers saw the shadow of a horse burst from the gap in the rocks. They thought there was only one, but in the dark canyon there were two. One holding the other, a rifle flashing like a falling star. Gunfire cracked. One rider fell. A scream tore through the desert. Jonas swayed, fingers clinging to the horse's neck, his eyes unable to tell rock from sky. Nia cried out for the first time, not with words, but with a bullet driven straight into the chest of the same lieutenant who had once come to the cabin. His blood sprayed across the stone, leaving a streak of red no one would ever read. They escaped through the canyon. No words of thanks, no triumphant shouts, only breathless gasps and darkness. When the moon emerged from behind the clouds, Nia laid Jonas down on soft grass beside a narrow creek. He had lost a lot of blood. His eyes could no longer make out shapes, but his chest still rose and fell, like a wild animal not ready to die. She tore cloth, stopped the bleeding, fetched water to clean the wound. Those small hands, once tied to a tree, were now the only thing keeping a man from slipping into oblivion. They didn't know who they had killed, didn't know how long they would survive. They only knew this: that night, in the canyon that had once been a place for hanging, now echoed the sound of a horse breathing, of water trickling, and the faint breath of a man who no longer wanted to run from himself. The first morning after their escape brought no sun, only a pale mist, thick and dull, like a dream left unfinished. The narrow creek wound its way between gray stones and brittle grass, babbling like a lullaby no one spoke aloud. Jonas lay there, his head resting on a bundle of soft grass that Nia had wrapped in his old coat. The coat's shoulders were frayed, still carrying the scent of kitchen smoke in every thread, now soaked with blood. Blood that once belonged to war, now turned into life, kept intact by the small hands of a girl who no longer feared the night. His breath came like that of an old tree, broken in rhythm, at times seeming to stop completely, then rising again gently, like wind tiptoeing over stones. His eyelids were half shut, his left cheek bruised, but there, beneath the loosened collar, a pulse still beat, slow, deep, like a drum sounding from the other side of the world. Nia knelt beside him. She didn't cry, didn't speak. She simply did small things, as though tending to a broken piece of earth, not a man. She peeled fruit with her small wooden knife, scooped creek water into the carved wooden cup, wiped his face with the handkerchief left behind by Jonas's mother, now worn as thin as his breath. Each time he groaned softly, she placed her hand on his forehead, not to soothe, but to say, "I'm still here." And for the first time, that hand was no longer the hand of a survivor, but of a guardian. Evening bled through the treetops, dappled like blood soaking into earth. Jonas opened his eyes, not fully awake, not fully dreaming, just a movement, barely more than a breeze across water. His gaze drifted, then landed on her face. The fire's glow lit the sun-darkened curve of her cheek, and in his eyes, for the first time, there was no trace of guardedness. She was adjusting the thin blanket, murmuring something in the old Apache tongue, a prayer, maybe, to ancestors. Her voice didn't tremble, but something in it dissolved, like salt in a stream. Jonas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, just the first crack in a long silence. "Your real name." His voice was dry as wind brushing brittle leaves. "Is Ayana. It means still river." Jonas didn't answer at once. He simply closed his eyes. His fingers brushed the edge of the blanket, as if feeling cold for the first time. Then, so soft only she could hear, that name kept me alive. That night the fire burned late. Ayana sat watch beside him, holding the old rifle, not to shoot, but for warmth. There was no smile on her lips, but in her eyes there was light, the light of someone who had once been strung up on a tree, now finally called by name. The months passed slowly, like Jonas's first steps along the edge of the creek, where slick stones and dry grass wove together into a mat of quiet patience. Each morning he practiced walking, his hand gripping the thick branch Ayana had planted in the earth as a cane. Some days the wind blew so hard he toppled like a straw post, but he never groaned. Ayana would run to him, help him up, then sit beside him in silence. No need to ask where it hurt, just to be there, because sometimes falling down is part of staying alive. They never went back to town, never built a big house. They raised a shelter instead, wood and stone with a roof of dry grass beside the small creek where Jonas had nearly died. Call it a home or just a place waiting for another season. Both would be true. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a small cradle Jonas had carved from old maple, a wood too warped to bend easily, but strong and uncracked. The cradle sat close beside the bed within arm's reach of the fire. They didn't say, "I love you," didn't name the bonds between them in the old ways. Just let habits intertwine, like thread sewn through worn leather. Each night Ayana placed Jonas's wooden cup by her bedside, not with water but filled with freshly picked sage. Jonas stopped locking his chest. The things that mattered he began leaving where she could reach them. One night, when Ayana came down with a fever during a storm, Jonas stayed up carving cypress bark through blistered hands, dropping it into boiling water. In the morning, when she woke, he only said, "Elam used this when he was wounded. It doesn't fix everything, but it holds a person long enough for morning to come." After that, she always folded his shirt when it dried, placing it next to his pipe. A silent sign that said, "I'm still here." No one remembered exactly when they began sleeping in the same bed. One cold night, she lay beside him, as if she always had, and Jonas, instead of turning his back, wrapped his arm around her, as if embracing a memory that no longer hurt to carry. Ayana never said she was pregnant. She simply started eating more, then walking slower, then stopped climbing the high hills. Jonas never asked. He just spent longer evenings carving wood, splitting cord, his hands busy shaping what silence could not say. Outside, the land stayed harsh, but inside, everything had softened, even memory. One day, as a gentle rain fell, Ayana placed a hand on her belly. It hadn't grown much yet, just a slight rise like a hill in early season. Jonas watched, then stood and took something from his chest. An old headscarf, his mother's. Its color had faded, its corner embroidered with a tiny sage blossom, now barely visible. He said nothing, just handed it to her. Ayana accepted it, didn't ask who it had belonged to, didn't promise to treasure it. She only nodded, the way someone does when they understand that real gifts require no instructions. Each morning Ayana walked to the creek, sat on the largest rock, her feet in the water. She whispered to the unborn child in a language no longer printed on maps. Jonas stood in the distance, never intruding, just carved new marks into the cradle, a sun, a fox, and a river flowing between 2 clasped hands. They never spoke of soldiers, never spoke of blood or fire or the faces that once haunted their dreams. Instead, they counted how many new leaves had sprouted after each rain, how many steps Jonas could walk without a cane, and how many nights Ayana slept without waking in fear. One evening, as the wind made the thatched roof whisper like voices in prayer, Ayana looked up at the sky and said softly, "If the child is a boy, I'll name him after the stream. If it's a girl, I'll name her after the first wind she hears." Jonas didn't reply, but he stood, went into the house, opened the cupboard, and took out the only book still intact. He laid it gently on the table. The cover was faded. Thoreau, Walden. He tapped lightly on the cover, as if to say, it knew nothing about the frontier, but it knew how to live close to the earth. They had no vows, no wedding, no paper to show the world for permission. Only a man, a woman, a cradle waiting, and a new life, rising from what had once been broken, without needing a promise. A thin afternoon, like smoke, the desert wind slid through sparse trees, stirring the dry thatch atop the roof, now faded after the short rains of the season. The last light of day fell at an angle across Ayana's form as she walked slowly toward the stream, one hand resting on her belly, as if cradling a secret that didn't need words. The stream still murmured just as it had the day they arrived, still flowed that same direction, unhurried, unresisting, unapologetic. Ayana sat down on the familiar rock. Her long hair fell over her shoulders. Her fingers touched the water. She did not speak aloud. She breathed with her soul, as if each drop of water listened from the other side of the canyon. "You will never have to bow your head because of your skin." The words didn't travel far. They dissolved like mist into the dusk. But the earth heard, the sky recorded, and somehow so did the child in her womb. Behind her, Jonas's familiar footsteps stopped a short distance away. He didn't call out, just stood there. His frame thinner, his limp still there but steady. In his hand, a worn rope. At the end of the rope, a square piece of wood. He said nothing as he approached, just bent down and took her hand. Their fingers laced together, like two old trails once parted, now meeting again at a nameless crossroad. On the wooden post beside the house, the same post that once held rusted tools and memories Jonas hadn't dared name, the wind turned a wooden sign. It wasn't the old sign. "White man don't forgive" had long turned to ash, though soot still lingered beneath the hearth. This one, carved by Jonas from maple near the creek, bore only a few words, scratched in with a dulled blade. "We begin here." Not a proclamation, not a dream, just a small sentence left behind for anyone who might stumble upon this place, to say, there is a place in this world where people do not begin with hatred. Evening dimmed. Two figures, one white, one brown, stood hand in hand on land unnamed by any map, beside a home no law ever permitted but built by trust. And the child, not yet born, had already become the only reason they stayed. The story doesn't end in victory. It doesn't end in justice. It ends with the smallest truth the West ever taught. Forgiveness doesn't come from a gun. It comes when someone places their hand into another's wound and doesn't pull away. Some people spend their whole lives just looking for a place quiet enough to bury a dream. And some, even shattered, still gather the pieces of their past, slowly, to build a small shelter for someone else. Jonas didn't save Elam, but he didn't turn away from Ayana. Ayana didn't change the world, but she reached for the hand of a man who once thought he had nothing left to believe in a place like the West, where the wind keeps blowing and no one remembers which direction it used to come from. Maybe the bravest thing is not surviving, but choosing to begin again with someone else. If you've ever made it through a stretch of loneliness that felt like there was no turning back, or if someone once reached for you when you no longer believed in anyone, leave something in the comments. It doesn't have to be long, doesn't have to be perfect, just has to be true, because somewhere out here on this wide land, someone may be reading and realizing they're not as alone as they thought.